Today's date is December 19th, 1995. Survivor is Alexander Kuhn. The interviewer is Alyssa Katz. It's taking place in Southfield, Michigan, in the United States. And the language is English.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Alyssa Katz, A-L-Y-S-S-A-K-O-T-Z. Today's date is December 19th, 1995. I'm conducting an interview with Alexander Kuhn in Southfield, Michigan, in the United States. Can you please say your name and spell it, please?
Alex Kuhn, K-U-H-N.
Can you please state your name at birth?
Sander Kuhn, K-U-H-N was the same last name.
Can you spell the first name?
S-A-N-D-O-R.
Great. Your date of birth?
November 20th, 1929.
How old are you?
I'm 66 years old.
And can you please give the city of your birth and spell it?
Kisvárda, Hungary, K-I-S-V-A-R-D-A.
Okay, great. Can you start by telling us a little bit about your life before the war?
I was born into a family of 9. I'm the fifth of 9 children. I had 2 older brothers, 2 older sisters. When I came along, I had an older sister deceased. She had died as an infant. And we lived in a community that was a fairly large Jewish community, about 10 to 12,000 Jewish people, a very close-knit community. My parents were observant. The holidays were important to us. Not just the holidays, but I remember my mother supervising in the morning, saying our daily prayers in the morning. And if one of us should get done a little faster than she thought was possible, she would make sure that we would start all over again. In 1932, my younger sister was born, Ibi. In 1933, my younger sister Vera. And in 1935, my younger brother Imre. At that time, in 1935, we moved away from Kisvárda. My father got a position in a alcohol distillery not far from there, near Sárospatak. I don't know if you need the spelling on that.
Okay.
S-A-R-O-S-P-A-T-A-K. And soon my oldest brother got involved in the refining business. He learned that from my father, and worked along with him in the plant. And many times they would work around the clock, and they would alternate the shifts. So one would be catching a short, brief snooze in the office, and the other one would be working. In 1937, my father was fired because it was a government-controlled industry, and they no longer employed Jews as early as 1937. My parents moved to a small town in Western Hungary, and my younger sister and I were left with my grandparents to go to school, because where they moved to, there were no Jewish school facilities available.
How was that to be separated from your family?
It was very difficult. Mind you, I was 7 years old, and even my grandparents, my grandfather, they weren't able to feed both of us every day on a daily basis. So my sister ate at my grandfather's, and I ate at different relatives' houses every day of the week. And that's how I started out my education. And for 2 years, I lived there, and I didn't see my parents for 2 years.
Can you tell us a little bit about your schooling then?
I went to a public school in the morning, and in the afternoon to a Jewish school, Hebrew, till evening. And then I would go have my dinner at a relative's house, and then back to my grandfather's, and homework and so on, and started all over again the next day. Already in 1938, it wasn't unusual that we got beat up by non-Jewish kids on the way to school. These were my first early memories of my education in Hungary. And especially because we lived in a community, and my grandfather saw to it that I was getting the kind of education that he wanted me to have. I had the side curls, which you may be familiar with if you know any Hasidim in this community. And that was easy target. I was picked out readily by non-Jewish kids, and we were beaten up regularly. In 1939, both my father and my oldest brother were called into the army. In 1939, this was still in the regular army. In 1939, my father was in for 6 months, and then when he was discharged from the army, he picked up my sister and I and took us home that time. And,
so you were reunited then?
We were reunited with the family, yes.
Now, did you continue your education when you were?
Yes, when we moved back home, I continued my public school education, yes. Excuse me, I gotta have some water.
Can you describe for us a Friday night in your household?
Friday night was probably the highlight of the week. Even when we didn't eat so well during the week, we always managed to have a family dinner Friday night. Everyone was together. Candles were lit. In our family, it was a tradition that one candle for each member of the family. This varies from family to family. Singing during dinner, after dinner. And my fondest memories of my childhood revolved around Friday night and Saturday. Because there were no synagogues nearby, we did not go to services. Saturday morning, we would say our prayers at home. My father would sit down at the head of the table, all of us around the table, and he would read the portion of the week, the portion of the particular portion of the Chumash, from the 5 books of Moses. And those are my early memories of my childhood.
Can you tell us when your life began to change?
Well, soon after, my brother was shipped out to the Russian front with his
1939?
with his unit. Actually, in 1940. And for a while, we had correspondence from him. In the summer of 1942, correspondence ceased, and before he was shipped out, he came home for an overnight furlough, which wasn't exactly legal, but he managed to come home, say his goodbyes, and he told us, among other things, that we shouldn't worry if we don't hear from him. Well, in October of 42, we received the last letter from him, and nothing after that, nothing after 42. Subsequently, we found out that he became a prisoner, a Russian prisoner, and spent 5 years in Siberia.
Do you remember, around the time that your brother left, do you remember being aware of the political situation in Germany, or the
Up to a point. Even earlier, around 40 or 41, 1940, I think, when the German army moved into the Balkan countries, they moved in through Hungary. And we lived in the southwest corner of Hungary, which was convenient for the German tanks to drive through from Germany, Austria, through Hungary to Yugoslavia and on to Greece. So I knew there was a war going on, followed the war from the newspapers. In 41, 42, we were still allowed to have a radio and newspaper. Later on, that too stopped because as Jews we couldn't be trusted. We weren't allowed to have any radios. We had to deliver the radio to the police department.
Were you aware of what was happening to Jews in other countries, in Poland, or?
On a very, very limited scale. I remember my mother getting a letter from her sister that one sister who was married to someone from Poland, or probably Galicia. They were deported, they were put across the border, the entire family, and never heard from again. So I remember my mother crying. She was very upset, and these things were happening in isolated cases, not in a mass situation that happened later.
Do you remember your parents talking at all about the situation? Did you have any options as a family?
We had options because we lived so close to the Yugoslav border. My older brother, Miklos, and we talked about going across the border and hiding with the partisans. My mother vetoed that. She said, wherever we go together. Of course, nobody knew what was about to happen, and at that time that made sense.
Did you hear rumors about places like Auschwitz or Treblinka?
Nothing. Don't forget, once we were so isolated that once the radios, and there was no television yet, radios, newspapers, magazines stopped, we were really isolated. And the government saw to it that the amount of news that got out, especially from the camps, was very, very limited. Only from personal contact. If somebody escaped or saw somebody being deported, other than that, there was nothing in the newspapers about it. This is not something that they want to talk about.
Can you tell us what happened next then?
In 1942, my father lost his job again because, again, he was working in an industry that was government controlled. They were no longer employing Jews. And at that time, he didn't work for a year. And there were still 6 of us at home, 6 children. And I remember living in a cold flat that winter of 42. Ice covered the windows, and very little food. I remember my father walking home one day. He got some kind of temporary work about 10 kilometers away from home and walked home. He said it was either buying a loaf of bread or taking the train. Didn't have enough money for both. So he walked home from 10 kilometers, which is about 6 or 7 miles, with a loaf of bread. That was the situation in 1942. Excuse me. Things deteriorated very fast from then on, to a point where in 1944, March 1944, Germany occupied Hungary, and they started assembling all Jews in ghettos. This was a completely a foreign concept to us. We lived in relative freedom in Hungary for years and for many generations, especially under the Austrian-Hungarian relationship. And we were taken to an assembly point, which was the county seat. The number of people, I would be guessing, but probably somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000. Lived under very crowded conditions. You were only allowed to take with you whatever you could carry. Some clothing and some food. We were in a ghetto for no more than 4 weeks. And after that, the ghetto was emptied. The entire community was taken out to a large open field. Actually, it was a quarry, a gravel pit. And we were kept there for 7 days in the open. It rained for 7 days, never stopped. And the head of each household was taken in for interrogation. By interrogation, you have to understand that included substantial beating. They wanted to find out who had hidden valuables, gold, money, jewelry, and so on.
Who were the guards at this point? Were they the Hungarian?
At that point, they were mostly Hungarian gendarmes who were trying to score points probably with the SS and behaved, if anything, more brutally than the German SS. Mind you, these were your neighbors. These were people that you grew up with, people you knew.
So would you say then that the Christian response to what was happening to the Jews, were they in favor of it, or?
The Christian response, at best, was silence. When we were being marched to the railroad station to be loaded into freight cars, they lined the streets, shouting all kinds of obscenities. Nobody stopped traffic. Nobody laid down in the middle of the street or marched in protest. In many cases, the houses were ransacked as soon as people were taken out of their houses.
What were your feelings about all this, still being quite young?
Well, you have to remember, I was only 14 years old, mostly confused. Only much later, in retrospect, did I have a chance to even think about it. How could people stand by and not do anything? And that was true of your neighbors in the community, Western governments, including the Jewish communities of this country and France and England.
So was the whole ghetto liquidated at once then?
This entire process in Hungary took less than 2 months, with the exception of Budapest. Budapest was a unique case because the Jewish community in Budapest, even though they were in a ghetto, they were not deported as a community. Individuals were picked up if they would leave the ghetto, or even within the ghetto walls. They were picked up, and some of them disappeared right there. There were executions, I'm told, right on the banks of the Danube. Others were deported, were taken to Auschwitz. But the rest of the country, in a period of approximately 2 months, 700,000 Hungarian Jews were deported.
And your family was among those?
My family was among them, in a freight train, in a freight box, old and young children, some sick, elderly. It was a 3-day train ride that stands out as probably some of the worst days in my memory.
Can you tell us why?
Well, first of all, the conditions within the railroad car, crowded, anywhere from 80 to 100 to 120 people in a freight car. Sanitary conditions were terrible. In the beginning, we had some food with us, no water. And this was already in the beginning of May 1944. And I remember it being very warm in the freight car. And after 3 days, because we didn't know where we were going, after 3 days we arrived in Auschwitz.
Did they tell you where you were going?
No.
When you...
No. The entire deportation was cloaked in the idea that we're being resettled. Families will be kept together. It will be different conditions, but nobody talked about mass killings or families being separated. And that was one of the reasons why there wasn't the mass escape that you would think under those conditions people would turn to. Because you held out the hope that, yes, we're going to be together, things won't be so good, but we'll make it through.
Were you together with your family on the train?
At that point, we were still all together, except my two older brothers. One was already a prisoner in Russia, and the other one disappeared in a labor camp in Hungary, Miklos.
your father made it back from the interrogation?
Yes, my father made it back from the interrogation, and he was with us in the train.
Can you describe for us your arrival at Auschwitz and what you saw when the doors opened?
The picture that I remember were many SS uniforms with dogs, with German shepherds, and men and women being separated immediately as we got off the freight train. Men and boys to one side, women and children to the other side. I remember being waved to go with my mother and my younger brother and my sisters, and I saw my father going off by himself. I instinctively ran after him, and we stayed together after that for the next several months.
Did all this happen very quickly?
All very, very fast. It seems the entire process probably less than an hour. At least that's the way it seems to me now.
Were you able to say anything to your mother or your sisters before
No.
you were separated?
Nothing. Nothing. And that remains as one of the most difficult things to deal with. That there were no goodbyes, there were no, perhaps it was better that there wasn't. But even as a young child, I realized the pain on my mother's face and on my father's face. More so my father, because I spent several months with him in the same camp. And that was very, very difficult. I'm sure it was more difficult for him.
When we left off, you were describing your arrival in Auschwitz and the fact that you went with your father. Now, did a selection take place?
The selection took place right there as we got off the train. What happened to my mother and my sisters and my younger brother is really, I don't have any definite proof of what happened in the succeeding days or hours. But we know that that summer of spring and summer of 1944, most of the Jews from Hungary who arrived in Birkenau were killed. To jump ahead slightly, the reason that I got out from Birkenau, my father and I both, in September of 44, was that there were a number of people who were crazy enough to hold Rosh Hashanah services on the first day of Rosh Hashanah in 1944 in Birkenau. That must be the high mark of insanity. The services were broken up. 200 of us were lined up and taken out to the railroad station, put on a train, and sent to Matthausen. But that's jumping ahead of the story. But that's how I got out of Birkenau.
Okay, but upon your arrival in Birkenau, can you explain to us the registration procedure, what you had to go through?
There were no numbers. At that point, they weren't even tattooing anybody. We were put through shaving, undress into a large tiled room, which probably looked similar to a gymnasium or something that you would compare to an exercise room. several hundred people in there with shower heads in the ceiling. At that point, of course, we didn't know that there was such thing as gas, or fortunately, the shower heads were working, and we had taken showers there. After that, we were given the striped uniforms. In some cases, you got back your own shoes that you came with. Some cases you didn't. You found something that nearly fitted your feet. And again, we were lined up and marched to the nearest camp, which was several hundred yards away from the from this bath complex. I ended up, my father and I both, in a section of Birkenau that was referred to as the Gypsy Camp. One half of the camp was populated by gypsies, and we were supposed to be in the other half of the camp.
Can you describe the Gypsy Camp?
We weren't there more than 2 or 3 days when our buildings were locked, all the barracks were locked with us in the buildings. And for 24 hours we were kept inside. And we heard trucks pulling up to the gypsy barracks. And heard a lot of screaming, yelling, crying. When they let us out, there were no gypsies around. We didn't know what happened to them. We heard rumors that they were all killed or taken away to other camps. But as it turned out, they were eliminated that night. Some 15,000 gypsies.
Did the gypsies, did they also have the striped uniforms and the shaved heads?
No, at that point, they were kept together as families, as a matter of fact. There were both women and children with them. And there were none in uniforms. My father was in one building. I was in a building just one building away from him. We saw each other daily on a regular basis. The daily routine was long and tedious. There was no work being done. Get up 6 o'clock in the morning, lined up for a head count, because there was routine. Every time they want to exercise you, they lined everybody up. After the head count, if there was nobody missing, no escapes or attempted escapes, everything was fine, then you got your breakfast, which was a cup of coffee, a slice of bread. It has very little resemblance to what we know today as coffee. Then the morning went by, the rest of the morning, talking among us and trying to guess what was in store. And at noon, we were given a bowl of soup. There were no individual dishes or bowls. They were using the pots and pans that we brought with us from home. And depending on the size of the soup pot or whatever they used to ladle the soup into, if it was a large pot, they counted off 8 or 10 or 12 people, and we were given a bowl of soup or a pot of soup. No cup, no spoon. Everybody would take it to their mouth and take a mouthful and pass it on to the next one until everybody had their share of the bowl of soup.
Did fights ever break out, or?
No. It was interesting that there were no food fights, even though there was such tremendous shortage. Only later on, some of the more people who were more desperate, who had been there longer, told us that don't save any bread from evening to morning, because it will disappear. So you learned whatever food ration you got, you learned to eat it whenever you were served.
At this point, did you know what was going on at Auschwitz with the gas chambers and the crematoria right there?
I remember looking at the tall chimneys and with the dark smoke bellowing out of the chimneys. And at first, I had no idea what was going on. After a while, you hear talking about it, and you would see these carts with bodies being carried in and out of camp. And a definite burning smell that permeated the entire camp that was recognizable.
Did you ever talk with prisoners who had been there longer? Did anybody give you any advice or any?
Yes, there were very, very few though, because the turnover was so quick and so fast, especially in Birkenau at that point, that you didn't have a chance to come in contact with others. In the adjacent camp, there was a labor camp attached to Birkenau, but we really had no direct contact with them. We would see some of them across several sections of barbed wire that separated each sub-camp from the next section. And there was as close as we would come to coming in contact with them. Each section of the camp was surrounded by high-tension barbed wire. There were many instances of suicide. People would throw themselves on the barbed wire.
How was your father's morale at this point? How was your relationship?
That was probably the most difficult time. It was very difficult for me, and I can only imagine now being a parent and a grandfather, how difficult it must have been for him. At that time, I didn't fully appreciate it. What it means for a father to see a family destroyed in front of his eyes, torn apart, and your child going hungry. It's unimaginable. I remember him, he was a heavy smoker. He would trade away a slice of bread for a cigarette. We only got 2 slices of bread a day. But then I would take some of my bread and would give it to him. It got to a point where I was looking out for him, because he had completely fallen apart. And later on, when we were separated, I feared that he wasn't going to make it on his own.
But you were together until Matthausen, right?
We were together till Matthausen, and even in Matthausen. Getting back to that, leaving the Birkenau in September of '44, there was a brief train ride. I think it was an overnight train ride to Matthausen, and we arrived there. It was a much smaller camp. It was the first, my first impression that it was so much smaller than Auschwitz-Birkenau. And there we were put into a labor detail working in the a stone quarry.
How did you feel leaving Birkenau?
I didn't realize at that time what an important milestone that was in surviving. But in retrospect, it's obvious that had we not had that Rosh Hashanah service that morning, we would not be punished by being shipped out of Birkenau.
So were you frightened at the time?
Definitely, because of the uncertainty. I mean, you live with fear. That wasn't something that you countered occasionally. It was a constant thing that you dealt with all the time. Excuse me.
Before we go on to your Matthausen experience, can you just please briefly describe how the guards were at Auschwitz, how you were treated?
The guards in Auschwitz, most of the physical punishment was dealt out by the capos, who in most cases, they were the fellow prisoners. They may have been in there for various reasons, religious, political, criminal. Convicts were put into camp. And in many instances, the biggest, toughest, meanest guy was put in charge of the building, the block tester. And he on his own would do things like getting you up 3 o'clock in the morning, marching you outside, and with no clothes on in the fall or winter of 1944. And for a head count, that was routine. By then, he would ingratiate himself to the camp commandant, so he would get an extra loaf of bread or whatever.
Were the capos most often non-Jews, or were they?
Both.
Both?
Both. There were Jewish capos.
Okay, so were there capos in Matthausen?
Yes. In Matthausen, the capo that was in charge of my building, Building 26, was a convicted murderer. On your uniform, next to your number, you had a triangle that varied for convicted for different crimes. The black triangle indicated capital crime. And he walked around with his nightstick or hard rubber stick, and rather than talk to you, he would hit you first and then ask questions. That was routine. The building we were housed in had no beds. We were packed in, we slept on the floor, and we were packed in like sardines in a can. During the night, if you had to leave or go to the lavatory, you walked across people. There was no other way of getting out of there.
Were the prisoners at Matthausen mostly Hungarian, or were they from all?
All kinds. I was in camp with Russian prisoners of war. We had 2 or 3 Americans in Matthausen, flyers who were shot down. They were thrown into camp. Predominantly Jewish and some political prisoners. Socialists, communists, were various labor union leaders. I found out later that one of my fellow inmates was a man by the name of Blum, who later became Prime Minister of France, post-war government.
So you were assigned to a labor detail.
Assigned to a labor detail that consisted of walking down into a large open pit some 280 steps to the bottom of the pit, and you would lift a block of stone as large as you could carry, and sometimes if you picked up a small block, a cop or SS guard would see to it that you pick up a larger one and carry it to the top of the hill, back up 280 steps. Then you would drop it there. There were other prisoners who would cut it into smaller blocks or use it to construct a wall around the camp.
How long were your days?
From early in the morning till evening, 10, 12-hour days.
And at this point, you were how old?
I was 15.
So it must have been pretty hard work for a 15-year-old.
In retrospect, I don't know how I got through there. I can't picture myself now walking up 280 steps. You don't realize what you're capable of physically till you put to the test. And in many instances, I was tested, and I don't know how or why, but I managed to come through and survive.
What can you describe the food rations at Matthausen?
The food ration in Matthausen wasn't too different from Auschwitz. We got a slice of bread in the morning with some margarine, the regular coffee. At noontime, there was a cup of soup, and at night again a slice of bread. In many instances, if the work didn't come up to the standards or the expectations of the capo or the camp man in charge, there was no slice of bread at the end of the day. Then you went to bed even, went to sleep even more hungry than you would normally. That went on till November of '44. There we were still together, my father and I, side by side.
How was he holding up?
Terribly. He was a total emotional wreck, and my greatest fear was that we were going to be separated, and he wasn't going to make it. That fear was with me constantly.
Were you aware that of the German defeats on the battlefield? Were you?
No, we had no idea what was going on. Till late '44, early '45, there were some rumors that within the camp that the Russian front was getting closer. At that point, I was in Vienna, in a camp.
So you worked in a stone quarry, and then were you liquidated from that camp, or what?
From there, we were shipped out, both my father and I, with several hundred others, to Vienna. In Vienna, we were separated. He was shipped to Mödling, which is a southern suburb of Vienna, and he worked in a parts plant, and I worked in an assembly plant, airplane assembly plant, in Schwechat, which is a Vienna suburb where the airport is now.
Was that the last time you saw your father?
That was the last time I saw my father.
Did you say anything to him when you were separated?
If I did, I can only imagine what it might have been. I had the feeling that he wasn't going to make it. I don't know. I'm sure he had the same fear about me because your life hung by a thread every minute of the day. You never knew. We were in Vienna. We were housed in an old factory, and there we worked in an airplane plant. As a matter of fact, it was the very first jets that the Germans were trying to put into production as a last hope against the Allied Air Force. These were young kids. We were 15 years old.
Were the conditions a little bit better in this plant?
In the plant, it was better, certainly better than working in a stone quarry. It was a very small compound. The entire plant compound was surrounded by barbed wire, but there were no long marches from our sleeping quarters to the plant. It was very close by. Air raids were a daily routine. In the morning, we were taken out to the air raid shelter. By then, the Allied Air Force, the American Air Force coming up from Italy, was bombing Vienna on a regular basis, on a daily basis. And the routine was long hours. In some cases, we worked around the clock because they were trying to turn out as many of these planes as they could. We worked under civilians. The technicians, the engineers were civilians who commuted home every night.
How did they treat you?
There was no problem. As a matter of fact, this Austrian civilian who was in charge of my little unit around the airplane, the day before the camp was evacuated, he gave me an onion and a potato. Now, you have to remember what conditions were like in April 1945 to appreciate what an onion and a potato meant to a person living in Vienna, even though living as a civilian. And he gave it to me. That's what I left with.
Did it give you hope during the time of the air raids that the war might come to an end?
Yes, definitely. That was our single best hope. That we didn't even think of the danger of getting killed as a result of the air raids. Although we were taken out to a very safe shelter, there were all kinds of tunnels dug into the mountainsides around Vienna, and these shelters were safe. Somebody asked me once why they would bother taking us out to the air raid shelter. Well, the labor force was so depleted in Germany by then that anybody that could work at all was needed. All men of the age that they could serve in the army were already drafted, were already in the army.
At this point, when you were in the airplane factory, did you still have prisoners' uniforms on?
Yes, we were still in the striped uniforms, yeah.
The same that you had from Auschwitz, or were you given new ones in Matthausen?
Periodically, I think they were changed, not very often. Hygiene wasn't a primary concern. It was a tremendous problem. I remember being kept up at night by lice crawling over you and trying to get rid of it from the seams of your clothes. But there was no adequate bathing or hygiene facilities of any kind.
Were you able to foster any friendships at this point once you were separated from your father with prisoners?
Not what you would call a normal friendship. But in the unit that I worked with on the assembly line, I got to know a young guy my age who was from Slovakia. And the two of us, we looked out for each other.
How did you communicate? What language?
Communicate? By then I knew a little bit of German. With this fellow, I probably spoke either Hungarian or German. I didn't speak Yiddish then. I learned that later. You improvised. Whatever you couldn't understand, you tried to work around it. You got used to the idea of being together with people from all over, many, many different countries.
Alex, can you describe how your physical health held up or through this time?
Up to that point, other than colds or minor ailments, I didn't have any problem. Not till the camp was evacuated in Vienna. The camp was the factory was destroyed for all practical purposes the middle of February 1945.
In an air raid?
In an air raid. And shortly after that, after some cleanup detail in and around the plant and the camp, which lasted till the end of March, the 1st of April, the camp was evacuated. By then, we were told that the Russians were approaching Vienna, that they were no more than 40 miles away.
Who told you that?
Probably the civilians who we were in touch with, because they themselves were concerned at that point. The Russians weren't exactly welcome as liberators. And on the 1st of April, several camps from around Vienna, including the camp where my father was evacuated. We all met at an assembly point, approximately 3,500 to 4,000 men left Vienna at that point.
Were you looking for your father at this point?
I was looking for my father. I didn't find him. And the 3rd or 4th day into the march, 2 boys who were marching on either side of me, who were in camp with my father, told me that my father had died. They weren't sure that I was going to make it, and they wanted me to know. They knew that the exact time he was accused of sabotage, and he was shot in Vienna.
How did that affect you?
It's difficult to describe, but I was in a daze. My health wasn't very good at that point. We were marching barefoot. My shoes were in shreds, fell off my feet. This was the first week in April, when in the Austrian Alps it's still cold, snow-covered. And the march lasted 8 days. We were always told that the field kitchen was just over the next mountain or around the corner. We were never fed during the 8 days. Lived on snow, and we crossed some farm fields where we dug some potatoes out of the ground. Ate that. Plus that onion and that potato that this Austrian engineer gave me.
At night, where would you stay?
Slept in the field, wherever we happened to stop for the end of the day. Open fields. The guards at that point were not particularly careful, overseeing who was there and who wasn't. But there was really no place to go. Being in a striped uniform, you were an easy target. And it was obvious that the German army was retreating. Some of them, a tank column cut right through our ranks, ran over some of the marchers.
Did the treatment of the guards change?
At that point, I think they were concerned about surviving and not being identified. They kept their distance from us. If you asked them something, they didn't answer. They were afraid of being identified. And on the 8th of April, we arrived in Matthausen. The camp was in total disarray. There was no food or water. The crematory was not working. Bodies were piled up all over the camp. And just total confusion. Everybody waiting for something to happen.
How many of the original marchers made it?
Less than 500.
Made it back?
Made it back to Matthausen.
What happened with the ones who died on the way?
They were left at the roadside. That road from Vienna to Matthausen was littered with bodies. The following 3 weeks or 4 weeks to liberation was more like a fog. I remember sitting outside, not in my building, but outside on a plaza-like area, leaning up against the wall. And I was just generally weak.
Do you remember how much you weighed?
I weighed about 65, 70 pounds when we were liberated. Not more than that. The night before the camp was liberated, we could hear a small arms fire coming up the mountainside. The camp was on top of a hill. And we knew that something was going to happen soon. Saturday morning, early in the morning, maybe 9 o'clock, an American tank crashed through the gate with the American flag flying. There would have been reason to celebrate, but nobody was strong enough. Very few of us were strong enough to even stand up.
Where were the Germans at this point?
They had run away during the night. The last of the guards ran away during the night. There wasn't one to be seen in the morning. The first one we saw, again, those that were brought in by the army, and they were locked up because they were afraid what was going to happen to them. The American field kitchen was brought up. Everybody was given warm food and bread. And the first meal was hot dogs and baked beans. That's what the army had, you know. This was front line, you know. Many of us got sick on it. Fortunately, I wasn't strong enough to stand in line for food, and I ate very little. I was put in an ambulance and taken to the field hospital, which was in Gunskirchen, which is a small town right near Matthausen. And I spent the following 4 weeks in the hospital, recuperating.
At the time of liberation, how old were you?
I was 15. I wasn't 16 till my next birthday, which was 6 months later.
How were you treated by your liberators, the Americans?
They didn't know what to do for us. Some of them had candy bars with them, chewing gum. I didn't even know what chewing gum was. I've never seen it. The personnel, especially in the Army hospital, were terrific. They were helpful and considerate. Most of the beds were bunk beds, and I didn't have the strength to get up to the upper bunk, so I was given a lower bunk. And in 4 weeks or 5 weeks, I was strong enough to leave the hospital, and I befriended one of the one of the American soldiers, and he got permission to take me out and find a room for me in Linz, which wasn't too far away, maybe 20 miles away. And I lived with this family, this shoemaker, for about a year. That summer of '45, I got sick again. I was back in the hospital for another 2 or 3 weeks later. And while I lived in Austria, I tried to contact people in my hometown. I remember the name of the grocer, and I wrote to him. And his son had been in the Hungarian army on the Russian front, on the same section of the front where my brother was. And he wrote back to me that his son remembered seeing my brother in 1942, in late 1942, around October. But many of that section of the front was captured. So I had hoped that he was among those that were captured by the Russians, and that he survived. I never gave up hope on that. And late in 1946, after I had come to this country, I got a postcard from him through the Red Cross that he was still in Siberia, in Kirov, and that he was looking for any members of the family. He wanted to know what I knew, who survived, who didn't, and of course he was probably as poorly informed as any of us were as to what happened to the family. And he didn't get back to Hungary for another year after that, till summer of 1947, until we were in regular correspondence.
Did he stay in Hungary then?
He stayed in Hungary. He's there to this day.
So, back to your time in Linz, you never were in a DP camp then, a displaced persons
camp? No, I never
camp.
lived in a DP camp. I had an unusual situation because I got to know this young lieutenant, American lieutenant, who was working in the office of the military governor of Austria, General Mark Clark. He was able to help me get a permit to live as a civilian in Linz. And I lived with this family, and I learned the shoemaking trade. I worked, when I was well enough to do any work, I would go into the shoe shop for a few hours a day. And I learned how to make shoes.
Did the family treat you well?
Yes, they were part Hungarian, part Austrian. He himself learned his trade in Budapest, and like with many Austrians, they had a common background. I don't think he spoke Hungarian, and by then I knew enough German that I conversed with him in German.
So at this time, was it favorable not to be in a DP camp?
Well, it was certainly more comfortable accommodations. I had my own room. I came and went wherever I wanted to. I had access to theater tickets, wherever I wanted to go. Mostly through the shop where I worked. We had many of our customers were American GIs who were brought in things like food and cigarettes and candy bars and so on into the shop. So you got away from the camp atmosphere. That itself was a plus.
Right.
I visited the camp. There was a suburb of Linz that had a large DP camp. I knew a lot of people there, and I would go there regularly to visit them.
Did you ever consider going back to your hometown in Hungary?
I did very, very briefly. I considered it briefly. I never went back, not till much later.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, December 1945, I went to Vienna from Linz, and with the intention of going back to Hungary, looking for any family members. And I spent a few days in Vienna, and I turned around and went back to Linz.
Why?
Which was in the American zone. I couldn't stomach the idea of going back to Hungary. I had no desire to face those people that cared so little about people that they live with to be a party to destroying the community. So whether I was conscious of the decision or not, but I decided not to go back.
And then you made the decision to come to the United States?
Because I was under 18, President Harry Truman, through executive order, permitted some 2,000 youngsters to come into this country under the age of 18 who had no relatives either there or here. And I qualified under that, and I got to this country in September of '46.
So you had no family in this country?
Not that time. I didn't know anybody.
So what?
Subsequently, I found a couple of cousins here in Detroit.
So describe your arrival in this country and what you did, what you felt.
The day the ship docked in New York was a dock strike. It was no problem for us. I had one piece of luggage, which was probably the size of that monitor, with a few things in it, very few, with the most horrible headache that I ever had in my life. Everything was so overwhelming. Walking off this boat, it wasn't a big ship. We left Bremerhaven the same day that the SS George Washington left. There was a large troop carrier. We left on one of those small Liberty ships that were called banana boats. They were like 7,000 ton compared to 80,000 ton SS Washington. And the SS George Washington was damaged, hit a floating mine, went back to port, was repaired, and got to New York before we did. But New York was very overwhelming to me. I spent exactly 1 week in New York.
How long was your journey across the ocean?
8 days.
Oh, okay.
8 days. It wasn't particularly I wasn't seasick at all during many of the people I was with were seasick, but I wasn't.
So you only stayed in New York a week?
Stayed in New York a week. Again, it was right before the Jewish New Year, before the high holidays, September of '46. And I asked if they could place me somewhere with a family so I could spend the holiday with somebody. They said there was a family in New York that were looking for youngsters to live with them, and there was one family in Detroit. If I wanted to wait till after the holidays, there were more possibilities. So I said, no, I would rather go someplace be with the family. I was put on a train on a Tuesday night. I arrived in Detroit Wednesday morning. It was the day before the holiday. Again, it was overwhelming being in a new city and new family and everything. The family, the name of Kaner, K-A-N-E-R, was a large family. One son had just come home from Italy, from the Air Force, who incidentally, when we got to talking about his overseas duty, he told me that he flew on missions over Vienna, and he just happened to be over Vienna that particular day when our the plant I worked in, was destroyed.
At this point, could you speak English?
No, I probably learned 6 words on the ship coming over. There was someone in charge of the group who tried to teach us a few words, but I didn't know any English yet. Immediately after the holidays, I enrolled in an English class for about 4 months at Hutchins Middle School in Detroit. And after that, I enrolled in high school. I went to high school in the morning, and I took classes in Hebrew in the afternoon.
Were you glad to be able to get back to your education?
Yes, definitely. It was a more normal atmosphere. As I mentioned before, shortly after I arrived here, I got the first news from my brother. And after he got back to Hungary in '47, we started a regular correspondence. And he and I met for the first time since 1940, in 1964, here in Detroit. We brought him here, and we had our first meeting in 1964, after almost 25 years.
Did you ever speak about your experiences in Europe when you came over here at first?
No, for various reasons. I think one of the main reasons was that people really didn't want to know. They didn't want to hear about it. I think there was a certain amount of guilt on perhaps on the part of the community that more wasn't done that might have been done during the war or before. And at best we were tolerated. Mm-hmm. I had a difficult time adjusting to my age group. I had very little in common with them. The average 16-year-old in this country didn't have the package that I had to deal with.
Did you ever experience any anti-Semitism when you were in this country?
No, not really. Certainly not at that point. Ran into some later when I I was working, I was a salesman, I traveled. And you came across somewhat, especially in some of the smaller communities away from Detroit. But you learn to deal with it. Mm-hmm. To me, the greatest disappointment was the lack of effort on the part of the leadership in this country, of both national and the Jewish community.
To help out
And
during the war or after?
To do more during the war. After, I think the effort that was made was tremendous. People were brought into this country as much as was permitted under the quota system. More went to Canada, Australia, other South American countries. But I think the lack of effort, both from the national government, politically, and the Jewish community, was always puzzling to me.
And is there anything you'd like to add, or anything you'd like to say, anything I missed?
Subsequently, I would like to add that shortly after I arrived here, as a matter of fact, around 46, 47, I met Dorothy Grossman, who became my wife later, who's mother of our children, and grandmother. And today we number about the same as we did 50 years ago, when my family was still intact. So it took 50 years to come up to the same numbers that we had 50 years ago.
Okay, Alex, you ended by saying that it took almost 50 years to bring your family up to the number it was before World War II. And some of your family members are here today, so we'd like to have them start introducing themselves, tell how they're related to Alex. Okay, would you like to start?
Okay. Well, my name is Mark, and I'm Alex and Dorothy's son.
I'm Julie. I'm their granddaughter.
I'm Gloria, the oldest daughter, and Julie and Rachel are my children.
I'm Dorothy. I'm Alex's wife.
I'm Marla. I'm their daughter.
Okay.
I'm Rachel and the granddaughter.
Would anybody like to add a few words on the end of the tape?
I would like to briefly add that I know this is a very difficult experience for my parents to go through, and especially my dad. We are all very proud of what he's been able to do. I'm named after my grandmother, and each time I think of her and think of what my family has gone through, I'm very proud to be able to sit here and say that I am Alex Kuhn's daughter, named after Gitala, and forever know that our family is proud of my dad and my mom and the way they've been able to raise us to know who and what we are. And I hope that my children will forever be able to carry that on, to make him proud of who we are, and to know that he didn't go through this in vain.
Thank you. Well,
I would also like to say something. My papa has made an impact on my life like nobody else has. And while I admire and love each and every one of my family members for different reasons, my grandfather has made it so that every Hanukkah candle I light has more meaning, and every prayer I say has more kavanah, and everything I do has a bit more extra added meaning because I'm doing it also for him. And that will be forever.
thank you. Alex, would you like to say anything final?
Yes, just a few words. Having survived only my brother and I out of our entire family, I always felt a tremendous burden for survival. And you always ask the question why, and you always look for justification. For many years it was very difficult. After we were married in 1951, it became a little bit easier, and the reasons for survival came along. First Gloria, then Mark and Marla, and then the grandchildren, the ultimate justification for survival. And today we can say with reasonable assurance that my parents and my grandparents are represented in our children and our grandchildren.
Okay, we're going to pause here at this point, and we're going to be videotaping some photographs. Okay, we're on.
This photograph is the only photograph of my grandfather. At this point, he was probably in his 70s, perhaps late 60s. I'm tempted to say that he was a tall man, but I said that about my brother too, because of our age difference. As it turned out, when I met him after the war, that we were the same height. But from a perspective of a 10-year-old, when I remember my grandfather, he seemed tall.
When was he born?
He was born probably around 1850, in the 1850s.
And when did he pass away?
He died on the way to Auschwitz in the freight train, to the best information that I could find after the war. He was 92 years old.
Oh, can we get his name?
Yisroel Meir Kuhn.
Tell us who this is.
This picture was reproduced from a small photograph that was found after the war in my aunt's apartment in Budapest. My brother sent it to me, and a friend of Marla's, who's obviously a talented artist, reproduced it in, I believe it's in watercolor.
Can you tell us who this is?
This is my mother, Quito. The original picture was probably taken around 1919 or 1920. She was around 20 years old, perhaps 22. She's wearing a wig. She was young, she was a young married woman at that point.
And she passed away?
She passed away. She died in Auschwitz in 1944. This is the first document that was issued shortly after liberation of Matthausen. Was issued by the American commander of the camp, the liberator of the camp, William Keach, Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army.
What was its purpose?
The purpose was really the first piece of identification that you had with you. It showed who you are and where you're from. Because at that point, nobody had any documentation.
Okay. This is just a close-up of the left side of the document. That was much better. Okay. This is the right side of the document. I'm sorry.
In the upper right-hand corner, you'll see the number that identifies the prison number, 103597. That number was assigned in Matthausen, not in Auschwitz. This was issued to me in Linz, Austria in June of 1945. As a resident, since I lived as a civilian, I had that ID card so I could travel around around Austria, at least in the American zone.
What does it say your hometown, your home country?
My hometown and the address where I lived, in Linz, Austria, and the fact that I was a stateless, was not a citizen of any country. This was a passport issued to me in Austria so I could travel to the Russian zone and to Vienna in the fall of 1945. You note the swastika under the ink on the cover. This ID picture was taken sometime November or December of 1945. I was 16 years old.
Okay.
This shows my personal ID, the fact that I was born in Hungary. I was working for a shoemaker. Shows my birthplace in Hungary, but the date is incorrect. Got lost in translation.
The monitor went up.
The monitor went on.
There we go. This is our extended family with our 3 children with their respective spouses. Mark and Lorraine in front of him with Daniel. My wife Dorothy next to Mark. David and David Ruskin and Gloria. Next to Gloria is Rachel and Julie. Myself, David Weiss next to me. Marla, holding Casey. Next to Marla is Alana and Jordan. Jordan in the center.